Mother-in-law did everything to push my husband back to his ex. I remember the first time I met David like it was yesterday. It was at a mutual friends party, the kind where you just go because you're trying to meet people but end up talking to the same old faces. I had just come from a long day at work and wasn't really in the mood to socialize. But when I saw David across the room, something shifted. His smile was easy, but it was his eyes that caught my attention. Warm, like they were ready to listen, to understand. We struck up a conversation about nothing, really. The kind of chat that doesn't make a lasting impression until later, when you realize how much you clicked with someone. We started dating shortly after that. I'd never had a connection like that before. The kind that felt so natural. Everything seemed to fall into place. He was kind, attentive, thoughtful. Traits I'd always wanted in a partner. He was the one. At least, that's how I felt. As we grew closer, I learned more about his past. He told me about his previous relationship with his ex, Laura. She was the one before me, the serious one, the one he'd been with for a long time. I understood that. I'd been in long-term relationships myself, and I knew how difficult it could be to truly move on. But he told me it was over, that he was in a different place now, and that he wanted to build something new with me. He made it clear that Laura was a chapter of his life he had closed. I wanted to believe him, and I did. What choice did I have? We were building something beautiful together, after all. His friends, my friends, everyone who met us seemed to agree we made a great pair. But there was one person who always made me feel uneasy. His mother, Karen. From the very beginning, Karen's approval felt like something I had to earn. It wasn't overt at first, just small comments here and there that I brushed off. At first, she seemed like a caring mother who wanted the best for her son. But as the weeks passed, I started noticing things I couldn't ignore. David and I had only been dating for a few months when she invited us over for dinner. I didn't think much of it. After all, I was meeting his family for the first time. But that night, something in Karen's demeanor stuck out. She was polite, of course, but there was this underlying tension between us that I couldn't put my finger on. Every time I spoke, she'd look at me, not with warmth, but with a kind of cold scrutiny, as if she was sizing me up. At one point during the meal, Karen mentioned Laura, as casually as if we were talking about a neighbor or a distant friend. David always thought Laura was so good with people, she said, almost wistfully, as if it was the greatest compliment she could give. I froze. There it was, the first of many comparisons. David quickly changed the subject, and I laughed it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. But as time went on, I started noticing more of these small digs. She would praise Laura for being so organized or accomplished, always in the context of how much she had helped David when they were together. I had no problem with her mentioning her son's past. It was part of his life, and I had to accept that. But the way Karen spoke about Laura, with such reverence, made me feel like I could never measure up. It was as if she was setting some sort of standard, an unreachable one, and I was failing to meet it. At first, I kept quiet. I didn't want to stir the pot. But there were moments, after those dinners or phone calls, when I could feel my confidence begin to slip. I wasn't trying to compete with Laura, but it felt like Karen was always comparing me to her. Every time she mentioned her, it was as if my presence in David's life didn't quite match up to the legacy Laura had left behind. I told myself it didn't matter. I didn't need Karen's approval. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The more I tried to be a part of their family, the more I felt like an outsider. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I was starting to feel like I was living in someone else's shadow. Someone who wasn't even around anymore. David, of course, didn't see it. He was always so loving and supportive of me. He would brush off my concerns with a smile and a kiss on the forehead, telling me that his mom meant well and that it was just how she was. He assured me that I had nothing to worry about. But I began to worry. I couldn't ignore it anymore. It was subtle at first, these little things Karen would say. But now, as the weeks went on, I could feel her pull more and more in ways I couldn't explain. It wasn't until we had been together for almost a year that I realized just how deep Karen's influence went. We had decided to take a weekend trip together, just the two of us, to get away from everything and focus on our relationship. But just before we were about to leave, Karen called David. He had to take the call, something about a work issue, and he stepped into another room, leaving me sitting there, alone with my thoughts. I wasn't prepared for what happened next. I overheard part of their conversation. "David, you really need to reach out to Laura. I'm sure she's struggling with everything that's been going on. You know how much she loved you, and it might help her heal if you just checked in. You can't just leave things like that." I froze. My heart sank into my stomach. I had heard rumors that Karen had wanted David to get back with Laura, but hearing it out loud, from her own lips, was a shock. It was like a punch to the gut. I felt sick. It wasn't just a passing comment. This was a suggestion, a plea. She was trying to push him back into a relationship with his ex. My mind was racing. How could she do this to me? To us? David was the love of my life. We had built something so real, and here was his mother, trying to tear it down. David came back into the room, and I could barely look at him. He noticed the change in my mood immediately. "What's wrong?" he asked, his brow furrowing in concern. I didn't know what to say. How could I explain that his mother was trying to pull him back into a relationship with someone who wasn't even part of his life anymore? I didn't know if I was angry, hurt, or just completely blindsided by it all. But I did know one thing. I couldn't ignore this anymore. I couldn't pretend like everything was fine when I could feel her influence creeping into our relationship, trying to push me out of it. "I need some space, David," I said, my voice trembling. I need some time to think." David looked confused, clearly not understanding what was going on, but he didn't press me. He just nodded and left me alone to process everything. And that's when I realized, this wasn't just about Laura. This wasn't about his ex at all. This was about Karen. And I had no idea what I was going to do next. After that phone call with David's mother, I spent the next few days in a daze. It was hard to focus on anything else. Work, friends, even the simple joys of our daily routine. Everything felt clouded by the idea of what I had overheard. David had no idea, of course. He still didn't understand why I had pulled away so suddenly that weekend. I told him it was just stress, but inside, I felt like something was eating me alive. I tried to push it aside. I loved David. I wanted to believe in us. In the future we were building together. But Karen's words haunted me. They echoed in my mind whenever I closed my eyes. "You know how much she loved you," Karen had said about Laura. It wasn't the first time I'd heard her speak of her ex like that. But this time, it was different. This wasn't just nostalgia. This was an invitation, no, a demand, to reopen a chapter that I had hoped was closed for good. David's relationship with his ex had ended years before we met, and I respected that. We had our own history together. But his mother couldn't seem to let go. It wasn't just casual mention anymore. It was constant. Her remarks became more frequent, and I began to feel like I was losing my place beside him. Every time she brought up Laura, it was like a shadow looming over me, reminding me that I was still being compared to someone else, someone who wasn't even in the picture anymore. I remember the last time we had dinner at Karen's house. David and I were sitting at the table, talking about plans for the future. We were talking about maybe moving in together, something I was excited about. But as soon as the words left my mouth, Karen chimed in with her usual passive-aggressive commentary. "Moving in together? Well, you know, David and Laura used to talk about doing that. They were always so good at making plans, and she always knew exactly what she wanted." She leaned forward, her smile tight and forced, like she was trying to make the comparisons sound innocent. David didn't catch on, of course. He never did. He just nodded. "Yeah, we talked about it, but that's all in the past now." I wanted to scream, to tell her that it wasn't just in the past. That every time she mentioned Laura, it felt like she was reopening old wounds, like she was trying to rewrite history. But instead, I smiled politely and changed the subject, hoping that would be the end of it. But Karen's attempts to push us toward Laura didn't end there. Over the next few weeks, she started giving David more advice. It wasn't anything overt, nothing that could be directly pointed at her, but it was always there. Casual suggestions. Little nudges. For instance, she'd suggest he take Laura's favorite hikes or visit places she loved. She'd comment on how much better he looked after seeing Laura, or how she thought Laura would be happy if he did this or that. Each time, I felt my stomach churn, but David didn't notice. To him, it was just his mother being caring and helpful. At first, I kept my concerns to myself. I didn't want to sound paranoid. Maybe I was being oversensitive. But as the weeks passed, I couldn't deny the growing distance between us. I tried talking to David about it once, after another awkward dinner where Karen had made yet another comment about Laura. I brought it up gently, hoping he'd understand how it made me feel. "David, I need to talk to you about something. It's about your mom." He raised an eyebrow, his expression shifting slightly. "What about her? You know she's been a little much lately, but she means well." "I know, I get that," I said, my voice wavering slightly. "But I feel like every time she talks about Laura, it's like she's trying to push us back into the past. And I get it, I really do. She's your mom, she'll always have that history with you. But I don't want to be compared to Laura. I don't want to feel like I'm always living in her shadow." David looked at me for a long time, his lips pressing together as if he was processing my words. "I'm not comparing you to her though," he said finally. "I don't know why you think that. My mom talks about her because, well, she's my past, and she's a big part of it. But you're the one I'm with now. You know that." "I know you're with me," I said, my voice quiet. "But when she talks about Laura like that, I can't help but feel like you're being pulled back into that world. It makes me feel like I'm not enough." David's face softened, and he reached out to touch my hand. "I don't want you to feel that way. I really don't. But my she's always been like this. She means well, but she's stuck in the past. I'll talk to her." I nodded, trying to believe him. I wanted to believe him. But deep down, something was telling me that it wasn't just his mom's influence that was making me feel this way. It was something deeper. Something that had been brewing between us for months now. The more I thought about it, the more I realized it wasn't just Karen's casual comments. It was the way David would let them slide. It was how he would excuse his mother's behavior, how he would put her above our relationship, time and time again. I thought about the trip we had planned in a few weeks. I had been so excited for it, a chance to get away and just be with David, away from all the noise. But now, the thought of spending time with him felt like a quiet desperation to keep everything from falling apart. I didn't know if I was being dramatic or if I was simply seeing the truth for the first time. I had one more conversation with David, just the two of us, sitting on the couch late at night after we had both been quiet for a while. "I think your mom is trying to get you back with Laura," I said, my voice trembling, but firm. "And I don't know how much longer I can take this. It's tearing me apart, David. I can't keep pretending that everything's fine when I see the way she manipulates you, when I hear the way she talks about your ex like she's some kind of perfect match." David's expression hardened for a moment, and I could tell he was trying to find the right words. "I don't know what you want me to say, Rose," he said quietly. "I can't change the past. I can't change how my mom feels about Laura." "I don't need you to change the past," I replied, my voice rising. "But I need you to choose me. To choose us over whatever lingering feelings she has about Laura." David didn't respond right away. He just sat there, staring at the floor, his jaw clenched. I could see the internal battle happening inside him, and it made my heart ache. Because I knew in that moment, whether he said it or not, that he was still conflicted. And I didn't know if I could be the one left fighting for us, alone. Weeks passed, and things didn't get any better. In fact, it felt like every day I was being pulled deeper into the web Karen had spun around David's life. I tried my best to hold it together, to keep up the facade that everything was fine. But inside, I was unraveling. We had been to a few more family dinners at Karen's house, each one growing more uncomfortable than the last. Karen's comments were no longer subtle. They were blatant. The last time we were there, after a long, excruciating meal, Karen asked David if he had thought about calling Laura to check in on her. Her voice was so casual, so offhand, like it was the most normal thing in the world. I tried to stay calm, but I felt my blood run cold. My grip on my fork tightened until my knuckles were white. "Mom, not now," David said quickly, his voice edged with annoyance, but I could tell it was a half-hearted attempt to shut her down. He didn't seem angry, not really. More like he was just trying to avoid another argument. It was then that I realized something that had been creeping in the back of my mind for a while now. David wasn't fighting for me. He wasn't fighting for us. That night, when we were finally back at our apartment, I couldn't hold it in any longer. The frustration, the hurt, it all came spilling out. "David, I can't do this anymore," I said, my voice shaky. "Every time we go over there, it's like I'm invisible. Your mom constantly talks about Laura like she's some kind of ideal woman. It's like I'm never going to measure up, and I'm starting to think I'm not supposed to." David stared at me, eyes wide in disbelief. "Rose, you're making too much of this," he said, his tone gentle but dismissive. "My mom doesn't mean any harm. She's just trying to be involved in my life. She's been there for me through a lot. I can't just shut her out." I took a deep breath, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. "I don't want you to shut her out. I just want you to see what's happening. You're letting her make me feel small, David. Every time we're around her, I feel like I'm just not good enough. And I can't keep living like this." David stood up, walking toward the window, his back to me. "I don't know what you want from me, Rose. I can't change how my mom acts. You knew what she was like when we first got together." I felt my heart sink. "I didn't know, David. I didn't know how much influence she had over you, how much she could make you doubt us." There was a long silence between us. I could feel the gap between us growing wider with each passing second. I wanted to reach out to him, to make him understand, but he was so caught up in his mother's web that I felt like I was talking to a stranger. Finally, David turned around, his expression conflicted. "What do you want me to do, Rose? You're telling me that you want me to choose between you and my mom." I felt a sharp pain in my chest. "That's not what I'm asking," I said, voice breaking. "I'm asking you to stand up for us, for our relationship. I'm asking you to set boundaries with her, to show me that we come first. I can't keep doing this if you're not willing to fight for me." David was silent for a long time, his eyes distant. "I don't know if I can do that," he said quietly. It was like a knife to the heart. He didn't have the strength to choose us. He didn't have the strength to protect me from his mother's constant interference. I didn't know if it was because he didn't see it, or worse, if he didn't care. But the reality hit me like a ton of bricks. He wasn't going to change. His loyalty was to her, not to me. And that's when it clicked. I could spend all my energy trying to make him see, trying to convince him that this wasn't right. But the truth was, I couldn't change him. I couldn't make him choose me over his mother. And if he wasn't willing to put in the work to protect our relationship, I wasn't sure I could keep fighting for it. "I think we need some space," I said softly. It felt like the only thing I could do. Give him time to think about what he wanted. "I can't do this anymore, David. I'm not going to keep fighting for something that you're not even trying to protect." David looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that made my heart ache. Guilt. He knew I was right. He knew that he hadn't fought for me, and he didn't know how to fix it. But it was too late. I couldn't keep hoping that he would change. I couldn't keep hoping that he would finally choose me over the influence of his mother. The next few days were filled with silence. I stayed in the apartment, trying to process everything that had happened. David was at work, and when he came home, we barely spoke. There was an awkwardness between us, a tension that I couldn't ignore. One night, a week later, he came home late. I was sitting on the couch, staring at the TV, not really watching anything. He stood in the doorway, looking at me, and I could see the weight of his decision in his eyes. "I talked to my mom," he said finally. "She's not happy about it. She doesn't understand why I'm choosing you over her, but I told her I had to. I have to put us first." My heart swelled with a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that he had finally stood up to her, but sadness that it had taken this long. I had wanted him to do this months ago, to set boundaries before it got this far. But there was something else, something I couldn't ignore. "David, I need to know that you're not just doing this because you think it's what I want," I said softly. "I need to know that you're doing this for us." David sat down next to me, looking at me with a vulnerable expression I hadn't seen in a long time. "I'm doing this for us, Rose. I know I've messed up, but I want to make things right. I want us to be happy, and I want to fight for this." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But I had to wonder if I was just holding on to something that had already started to slip through my fingers. Days passed in a quiet, heavy tension. I kept telling myself that things might improve, that maybe David would finally realize the damage caused by his mother's constant influence and manipulation. But deep down, I knew that the cracks in our relationship had already begun to show, and I wasn't sure if they could ever be repaired. David tried. He really did. He began doing things that seemed like attempts to make up for the hurt, like planning little date nights and bringing home flowers when he knew I'd had a long day at work. But despite his efforts, there was something in the back of my mind that I couldn't shake. Every time he left the house or spoke about his mom, I felt a pang of insecurity. It was like I could hear her voice in the background, whispering her doubts, her expectations, her criticisms. It was as if she was always there, lingering over us. It wasn't just the big moments that bothered me anymore. It was the small, everyday things. The way David would still dismiss my concerns. How he couldn't seem to see how deep my hurt ran. I would bring up how uncomfortable it made me when Karen would show up unannounced, or how she'd offer unsolicited advice about our relationship. David would listen, but I could see it in his eyes. He was tired of hearing about it. Tired of hearing me voice my frustrations about his mom. A week after our conversation about boundaries, I found myself sitting alone in our apartment, the quietness of the space pressing in on me. David had left for another one of his solo trips to see his mom. A regular visit that had become a norm ever since we'd started dating. I'd always accepted it before, understanding the importance of his relationship with his family. But now, every time he left, it felt like another wedge was being driven between us. I tried to distract myself by diving into work, keeping myself busy. But as the day wore on, my thoughts kept drifting back to that moment. The one when David had looked at me with guilt in his eyes, telling me he'd stood up to his mom. I wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that he'd finally chosen me. But the reality was harder to accept than I had expected. Because no matter how much he tried to reassure me, his actions still spoke louder than his words. A few days later, when David returned, I could tell right away that something had changed. He was different, distant, maybe a little tense, like he was walking on eggshells around me. At first, I thought it was just the stress of everything he had been dealing with. But it didn't take long for me to realize that something was off. "Hey," I said quietly when he came in, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "How did it go with your mom?" He hesitated for a moment before answering, looking down at the floor. "It wasn't easy," he said, his voice low. "I told her that I couldn't keep letting her dictate everything in my life. That I needed to focus on my relationship with you and set boundaries." I nodded, though my stomach was twisting. "And how did she take it?" David's silence spoke volumes. He sighed and rubbed his forehead. "She wasn't happy, but I think she understood. Or at least she said she did." He paused, then added, "But I don't know, Rose. I feel like she's still upset, and I can't help but feel guilty about it." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. "David, this isn't about guilt. It's about us. I don't need you to keep carrying the weight of your mom's feelings. I just need you to be here. To be with me. He looked at me with conflicted eyes, like he was struggling to choose between two people he cared about. I know, and I want to be with you. But I don't know how to do that without upsetting her. She's always been there for me, and I can't just turn my back on her. His words stung more than I expected. It was the same cycle, the same issue that we had been circling for months now. He was torn between his mother and me, and no matter how much I wished it, I couldn't be the one who fixed that. I don't want you to turn your back on her, David, I said softly. But I can't keep being the one who feels like I'm not important enough. I'm asking for your support, and it feels like you're still letting her get in the way. David was quiet for a long time, and I could see the inner conflict waging within him. His eyes softened, and for a moment, I saw the person I had fallen in love with. The man who once made me feel like I was the most important thing in his life. But that man felt far away now, buried under years of his mother's influence. I love you, Rose, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I don't know how to fix this. And there it was. The painful truth that I had known deep down all along. He didn't know how to fix it. He didn't know how to choose me, and no matter how much I wished it, no matter how many conversations we had, I couldn't make him see it the way I did. I took a deep breath and stood up, my heart heavy. Maybe we just need some time apart, I said, my voice barely audible. I need to figure out if this is something I can keep fighting for, or if we've reached the end of the road. David looked at me, eyes wide, a flash of panic crossing his face. Rose, please don't. I need space, David. I cut him off gently, though the words hurt to say. I need to figure out if this is something I can keep doing. I can't keep living in a relationship where I feel like I'm always second place. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, watching me, his face a mixture of hurt and confusion. And I knew in that moment that I had made my decision. I couldn't keep waiting for him to change. I couldn't keep hoping that one day he'd finally choose me over everything else. As I walked away, I felt the weight of it all press down on me, on us. It wasn't what I wanted, but it was what I needed.